Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Rewilding Big Cats in India, Kanha's Tiger School. And it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Aditya Panda. Aditya, thank you so much for presenting to us today. I know from talking to you earlier, you can't wait to get back into the field. So we're excited to hear what you have to share, the stories from your fabulous life out there with the tigers. So let's jump in.
Thank you, Sunny, and hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Daily Dose of Nature with me. As Sunny was mentioning, field season is about to start in India. I'm fortunate to be leading the first trip of the season, and that's almost exactly 2 months to the date from now. And it's going to be the Grand India Wildlife Adventure, which I'll talk to you about at some point in this webinar. But coming back to today's topic, a lot of you must have watched my last webinar on rewilding big cats in India. And on that webinar, we talked about various attempts at turning hand-reared cubs of big cats from Elsa the lioness in Africa to Tara the tigress here in India and a few leopards. They had been raised by humans who were very concerned about their future and did not want to see them ending up in captivity. So they did everything they could to turn them back into free-ranging wild big cats. But those experiments did not have a very high success rate, and the risk factors were way too much. So for those of you who've only heard my last webinar, you might have a notion that such experiments are doomed to fail and that there is no future for that sort of work with big cats. But in today's webinar, we are going to learn that it might actually be possible. But before that, before I get into the webinar, let me reintroduce myself for those of you who haven't heard one of my webinars in the past or haven't had a chance to travel with me here in India. My name is Aditya Panda, and I have been leading NatHab expeditions in India since 2016. I lead what we call our tiger trips, which are the Grand India Wildlife Adventure, India Tiger Quest, and India Tiger Safari, which is a photo pro expedition. When I'm not leading expeditions for NatHab, I am based in Eastern India in my home state of Odisha, and I keep myself busy with conservation work in tiger and elephant landscapes here. Now, let's get into today's webinar. Those of you who have been on our Grand India Wildlife Adventure or know about it or heard me speak about it on our webinars will hear of a place called Kanha Tiger Reserve, which is a park that I am unashamedly heavily biased towards. It's my happy place. It's an extremely beautiful park, and a big chunk of my heart stays there. Kanha is in central India, and in a landscape we call the Central India Highlands, and it is one of the finest protected areas for wildlife in India. It is one of our oldest national parks. It was notified a national park in 1955, and it was among our first 9 tiger reserves when Project Tiger started in 1973. But Kanha's conservation history goes well beyond that. It's been protected for wildlife, and has been off limits to hunting since 1933, the days when India was still under British rule, and Kanha has been protected since then. And Kanha National Park, a lot of you might have heard me say this, has always been considered the laboratory of tiger conservation in India. It has pioneered the best practices in tiger reserve management and tiger science, conservation biology. And it has many firsts to its credit. And today we are going to talk about one of the most interesting methodologies, one of the most interesting experiments that have been pioneered in Kanha. Kanha has some of the finest tiger habitat in all of India. It's spread over an area of over 2,000 square kilometers and has upwards of 120 tigers. It is also contiguous to other tiger habitats in central India and serves as a key source population of tigers in central India. Kanha is also located, as I was saying, at an elevation. So it's on average about 2,000 to 3,000 feet above sea level. Some places go even higher than that, some parts of Kanha. So that gives it a really pleasant change of climate from the infamous sweltering plains of India. So it's a thoroughly enjoyable place to be at any time of the year. And as many of you might know, it is one of the top destinations on our Grand India Wildlife Adventure. The Grand India Wildlife Adventure takes us through central India and northeastern India on a fabulous safari that lasts about 2 weeks, and we get to see a phenomenal amount of wildlife on that trip. It takes us to Bandhavgarh National Park, Kanha National Park, and Kaziranga National Park, where we watch rhinos and wild elephants and wild buffalo and a whole lot of other wildlife. So those of you who want to look up the trip can obviously visit our website. This is a screenshot of the trip from our website. So the story that I'm going to tell you about, I mean, who would imagine that there would be something called the tiger school? But of course, tigers do go to school. Their mothers are their teachers, and like all cats, like many wild animals, tigers need to learn the ways of life as cubs before they're ready for the big world. And that is true for tigers as well. But what happens when tigers get orphaned? What happens when, for whatever reason, their mother dies when they're too young, and they can't be, they can't survive on their own, and they don't have the benefit of their mother's training to teach them how to live. Well, in most cases, by and large, they're captured. If they survive, they're captured and they're sent off to zoos. But Kanha, in its famous way, has the park management of Kanha has experimented and pioneered a method that can probably be avoided. Now, look at this tiger. Fine young male, well, young in the sense that he's a young adult. He's entering his prime, sitting like the king of the jungle that he is in the middle of the road while safari jeeps watch. Very confident, bold male. He is called the Pattewala male. Pattewala means the one with the collar, and that's because this tiger used to carry a radio collar, a GPS collar earlier, but that's dropped off, of course, now, and he's one of the main dominant males in the Mukhi region of Kanha National Park. And those of us going to Kanha on safari now have a fairly good chance of coming across him. Now, what the video that I just showed you and what this picture shows you is a very confident, bold male tiger in his prime, ready to rule, ready to patrol and protect his territory, and to mate with the tigresses in his territory, and father a lot of cubs like tigers are supposed to do. But what the picture and the video do not show are that this tiger was actually rescued as an orphaned cub and reared. And there was a long process of rewilding, a very long and a very careful process of rewilding, which turned him into a totally wild tiger. And that's a very interesting story. The cub was probably a month or two old when he was found washed down in a flood in the park, and all attempts to find its mother and reunite the cub with the mother had failed. So the park management reared it and then rewilded it. And you know how this tiger school was set up in Kanha and how tiger rewilding has been possible is a very interesting story. And I'm going to tell you the story of how it started, when it started. Unfortunately, the story occurred in the early 2000s, and there are no photographic records of it available, at least in the public domain. I'm sure there are many with the park management. Because I do not have any photographic records of it to share with you today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this slideshow of pictures play in the background while I tell you the story. So, like our last webinar, it's going to be a nice rambling session of storytelling today. So, it all goes back to the early 2000s. I don't remember the exact year, but it was sometime between 2004 and 2009, if I'm correct. And during that period, India's premier wildlife institute, one wildlife biology institute called the Wildlife Institute of India, was conducting a study by radio collaring, GPS collaring wild tigers. They had chosen Kanha National Park as one of their key study sites. And, the scientists from the institute wanted to capture, tranquilize and capture and collar 10 tigers. And the study was expected to, it was expected to provide the scientists with a lot of data on tiger ecology, their territorial dynamics, what happens to, what kind of territorial dynamics breeding females have, what kind of territorial dynamics established males have, how far young males and young females travel from their natal area, and so on and so forth. So several tigers were captured and collared, and they were all being studied. And they literally had 24/7 observation being taken of them. Every moment of those tigers' lives was being monitored. There used to be elephants, trained elephants, like many of you see in our parks, with researchers and observers mounted on them, who used to work in 6-hour shifts, tailing the tigers. And there used to be 4 different shifts, and 24 hours these tigers were monitored and data was being recorded. So a fabulous, very fascinating study. And one of the study animals on that study was a tigress who was known then as the Link 9 female. Kanha has these uh, vast meadows that dot the park and that are one of the key ecological sort of characters of that landscape. And these meadows are linked to each other through fire breaks and narrow sort of grassy corridors, which deer like the Barasinga can use to move from one meadow to another. And each of these links has been given a number. And this tigress occupied the area around link number 9. So she was called the link 9 female or the link 9 tigress. The link 9 tigress at that point of time had 3 young cubs. She had just littered. Cubs were very young. And what happened was that a new male arrived in the area. A young male took over that area by ousting the father of the cubs. Now, what happens with tigers is that, a typical tiger territory is, there's a large territory that is controlled by a dominant male. And there are 3 or 4 subsets of this territory which are owned by 3 or 4 different females. Females require a much smaller territory than males do. And the territory of a male will usually encompass that of several different females. And, it's sort of like, it's similar to a lion pride in certain ways, in that the females that usually occupy these subset territories are related to each other, but they don't get along as well as a lion pride does. So in a way, it's sort of an expanded, a more distanced form of a lion pride. So you still have a dominant male who mates with each of the females, but the females have their own territories and they don't like sharing that territory. And as long as the dominant male reigns, he is going to protect his cubs. All the cubs that he fathers, he's going to protect them. He's going to socialize with them. He's going to look after them as well if he has to. But what happens when a dominant male starts to lose out or starts to lose his control over the territory to a younger, more powerful male, is that the new male is going to begin to invade upon that territory, take it over. And one of the first things that he does is to find and kill every cub fathered by the previous male. And, that is done with the intention of getting the tigresses into estrus again, so that he can mate and he can father cubs and his lineage will start. That's just the way of tigers. That's how it works. But the link 9 female, like many tigresses, was a fierce mother, and she put up a fight. She put up a fight with the new male. And usually, tigresses will fight to the death to protect their cubs. But usually, when a male and a female fight, when 2 females fight or when 2 males fight, those fights can get pretty nasty. But when a male and a female fight, the males are usually not that aggressive with the female, and they do seem to understand that they need to have good terms with the female, because in the future they intend to mate with her. But link 9 was a fierce mother, and the invading male was probably too aggressive. But in the rarest of rare cases, what ended up happening was that link 9 female was killed in that fight. And because the researchers were monitoring her, they found out immediately, and they could go and find her carcass when the death signal comes from the uh, transmitter in the radio collar. You see, when an animal doesn't move for more than a certain period of time, the transmitter begins to emit what is called a death signal. So the researchers found her carcass. They were quite surprised at how, in this most unusual of cases, a male tiger had actually killed a female. But they were very concerned about where her cubs were, because they knew she was lactating, and they knew she had cubs. But cats hide their cubs really well in the wild, and the cubs also have the sense or the instinct in them to remain absolutely quiet when they're hidden by mother. Mother usually hides them in a den among rocks or fallen logs or places like that, and she goes off hunting. And cubs know to remain absolutely still and quiet and not make any noise, because when they're very young, they can be killed by any number of animals. They can be killed by roving male tigers, they can be killed by leopards, they can be killed by pythons, they can be killed by jackals, even they can be killed by many animals. So the search for the cubs began. It took I think 3 or 4 days before they could be found. They were found in a rocky sort of hillock where she had hidden them. And the poor cubs, they were starving, patiently waiting for mother to come back. And they've been absolutely quiet all that while. And finally, when hunger started getting the better of them, hunger and thirst, they began to weakly sort of meow like cubs do. And that is when the park rangers and the researchers who were on the look for them, they heard those cries, and they found them, and they brought them. They took them to the field director's bungalow, the field director's camp office, which is in the center of the park. For those of you who visited Kanha on the Grand India Wildlife Adventure, it's very close to where we stop to have our breakfast at when we are in the Kanha zone. So anyhow, the cubs were brought there, and the field director's bungalow there is a beautiful colonial style bungalow on a small hillock, and it's very, very restricted access, so nobody besides approved staff go there. And the bungalow has 2 garages, one for the field director's official vehicle, and another if he happens to have a private car or a second vehicle. So one of the garages was empty, and the cubs were kept there. There was 1 male and 2 females. The cubs were kept there, and a person from among the park staff who had experience at hand rearing tiger cubs, orphaned tiger cubs, was put on the task of looking after them. So of course they were quite emaciated. They were starving. They hadn't eaten, or they hadn't nursed for quite some time. So they were given milk and glucose and things like that. And gradually they began to get some life back. Gradually they began to put on weight. And at that point, everybody's thought was, now what? Or now that we have these cubs, these are orphan cubs, what do we do with them now? The most obvious course was to send them to the zoo. But even that was a process that required some amount of time and some amount of paperwork. And anyway, the cubs would have to be slightly older before they could be declared fit to travel to the zoo. So the cubs continued to remain there at the field director's camp office. And the field director at that time was a gentleman called Mr. Hageshwar Naik. And he, just to be on the safe side, he decided that human imprint on the cubs should be minimal. He hadn't thought of anything as radical as rewilding or things like that, but just out of ethics and on the principle that these were wild animals, he thought that it was in the best interest of the cubs if human imprinting was kept to the minimum. So what happened was, instead of a person actually bottle feeding them, a rope cot was brought. The cot was placed sideways. The ropes of the cot were brown in color, so very natural kind of material. And the feeding bottles were inserted through the ropes, and the cubs gradually learned that they were the source of milk. And they began nursing from the cot without ever really seeing the person behind the cot. And gradually, as they grew older, they were fed milk and eggs, and then minced meat, and gradually they were given meat. At this point of time, even the field director had grown sort of personally very affectionate of the cubs. No one was allowed to visit them, no one was allowed to see them, but they were being observed in the garage through a window, and by the one caretaker who was permitted to look after them. And the field director started getting ideas. He was the thought that the cubs might be sent to the zoo was a thought that he was not very comfortable with and did not personally agree with. So he started trying to come up with solutions, with alternate solutions. And one of the thoughts that came to his mind was that if these cubs do end up having to be kept in captivity, then why don't they stay in captivity here in Kanha rather than being sent to the zoo? So, at the same time, he was also wondering and thinking if at all it might be possible to actually turn them into wild animals once again, if it might be possible to raise them in a way that that they would become capable of living in the wild. Nobody had done anything like that till then, barring, of course, all the human experiments like Elsa and Tara that I told you about in the last webinar. But he wanted to do it in a way where there was zero human imprinting. He did not want the cubs to be comfortable around humans. He did not want them to grow up to be tigers or wild tigers who were not afraid of humans. Wild tigers are by nature, wild tigers, wild leopards, most big cats are naturally nervous and afraid of human beings, which is one of the reasons they can survive in countries like India, and which is one of the reasons why there is some level of coexistence between humans and big cats in this country or any part of the world. So what he did was he found a place, a suitable area of the park, a place called Ghorela in the Mukhi zone of the park, which is a zone where we do most of our drives in when we are at Kanha. And in that area, he earmarked a part of about 15 to 20 acres in area, and had a massive enclosure built. Now, this enclosure was built in such a way that all the things that a wild tiger requires, cover, water, uh, grassland, everything was inside that enclosure. And you know, the enclosure was large enough to mimic the natural habitat of a tiger, and it was, in fact, inside tiger habitat. So it really was tiger habitat, except that this 15 or 20-acre patch was enclosed. And attached to the enclosure were quarantine smaller quarantine enclosures, where in case a tiger in the enclosure was sick or required veterinary attention, it could be constrained and treated. So the cubs were first kept in one of the quarantine enclosures, and gradually, from being fed breast meat, they were a few months old by now. They were close to a year old, if not more. Gradually, they started switching to live animals. So they started with chickens. When the first chicken was released, I think it was a rooster, and the cubs did not know what to do with it. They were terrified. When the rooster started flapping around, the cubs ran away in fear. But over time, curiosity took over, and the natural prey drive that carnivores have took over, and they managed to kill the rooster and eat it. And over time, as they were given more chickens and roosters, they had learned that these were food, and that they could be caught and killed and eaten. And in the next stage, they were given goats, which again they killed very clumsily, but they still killed and managed to eat them. And then gradually a period came when it was decided that they must be released into the larger enclosure, where they can start to hunt real prey, because you can't expect a wild tiger or these cubs to be ready for the wild when just on the basis of them being able to kill chickens and goats in a confined space. So the cubs were kept hungry for a few days. So because hunger builds the prey drive, and that is a very important drive that forces a cat or any wild animal, any wild carnivore, to try and find its own food. So they were kept hungry for a few days, and then released into the larger enclosure, which they immediately began exploring. The enclosure had been designed in such a way, with a double sort of gate that which could be operated remotely. It was designed in such a way that deer and wild pigs and other natural wild prey could be driven into the enclosure. And once inside the enclosure, those animals also had fodder and water for themselves, and they were prey for these tigers. So when the first spotted deer, were driven into the enclosure, and these three cubs were released into it. Again, at first they had never seen a spotted deer before, so they had no idea what to do about it. But gradually instinct took over, and they started chasing them. They had no skills. For a tiger to hunt requires a hell of a lot of skill and patience. It is a learned art. It is not something that comes purely from instinct. Cubs watch their mothers hunt, and through a long process of trial and error, they learn to hunt themselves. And then they might know the mechanics of hunting, but it takes them a long time to develop the patience that is required to be able to hunt successfully and skillfully. but these cubs did not have anybody to teach them that. So what ended up happening initially, what they would just chase the deer around till they tired the deer out, and like wild dogs kill, they would clumsily just tear apart the poor animal and eat. They had not learned the skillful art of, number one, crouching and stalking, number two, being patient for the prey to be within a close enough distance before attempting a charge. And number three, once they actually caught the animal, they did not know the classic big cat, bite that where the big cats attack the jaws, the neck of the animal, and the classic tiger or leopard way of killing, where they go for the neck of the animal of their prey and strangulate it by squeezing the windpipe, or in many cases the sheer momentum of the attack, the weight of the big cat and the impact of the attack just breaks the neck of the deer or whatever other prey animal it is, and kills it within a very, very short time. So these cubs had not learned that art, and they were beginning to be able to successfully kill a lot of deer, but they were doing it in a very messy, very a very amateurish sort of way. And how did we know what was happening in the enclosure? You might, I kept telling you that all of this was being done in a way so as to keep human imprint to an absolute minimum, if not zero, on these tigers. So what had been done was watchtowers had been erected around the enclosure, and these were fully camouflaged, and they had stairs leading up to them in such a way that a person getting into the watchtower would never be visible from inside the enclosure. And once the person was in the watchtower, there was a peephole through which he or she could observe the tigers and see what they've been up to. So, that is how we knew what was going on in the enclosure and what stage of development the cubs were at in their rewilding school. So gradually a period came when the tigers had technically become adults, but they still hadn't mastered the art of killing, and they were still not ready for being rewilded. And at this point, another concern began to appear. Now that they were technically adults, there was every chance that the male might mate with his sisters and lead to inbreeding, which was never desired. Besides, it was thought that it might be easier to rewild females than it would be to rewild a male, because the females, once they are released in the wild, hypothetically as wild tigresses, do not face the kind of competition that a young male would face. A young male would have to battle out many experienced wild males before he could have his own territory and establish himself. It was thought at that time that females would find it much easier. So with both these sort of factors in mind, inbreeding and potentially less suitable conditions for the male, it was decided that the male must be sent to a zoo, while the rewilding procedure would carry on with the two sisters. So the male was removed. The sisters gradually began fine-tuning their art of hunting. When they could not do the classic stalk and attack that a tiger is expected to do while hunting. They devise their own ways. In one trial and error sort of way, they found out that if one of the sisters stay crouching and stalking, crouching and in ambush in the grass, and the other sister sort of chased the deer towards her, she could kill it, and then both of them would eat it, which worked out fine. But what was still a concern was that they were still killing their prey in a very clumsy way and not in the typical way in which a tiger is supposed to kill it. So the way in which they were killing was not leading to an easy and quick death for the prey animal. And if you did that in the wild outside an enclosure, there was every chance that your prey would escape injured, but still probably escape. So, once, just again by trial and error, one of the sisters, while trying to kill a deer that both of them had caught, happened to bite the deer on the neck, on the throat. And in less than a minute, the deer died. And this was an amazing example of animals actually learning from experiences. And this tigress immediately realized that a bite to the neck kills the prey immediately and is much easier than all the other ways that they had been trying so far. So over time, she mastered the art of the throat bite and started killing deer and wild pigs and even larger prey, such as feral cattle and buffaloes, which were released once in a while into the enclosure. And it was decided that, around the age of 3 or 4, which is later than it would be under natural circumstances, but still around the age of 3 or 4, it was decided that the sisters were fit for release in the wild. And at that time, a village had been relocated from one part of the park. There is a voluntary scheme available to people or communities living inside thick forest areas or remote areas, remote wilderness areas in India, where they can choose to be relocated from that area and settled elsewhere, closer to civilization, closer to markets, schools, and hospitals. And they receive a very, very generous compensation amount for that, a life-changing amount, in fact. So under the same scheme, a village had been relocated from one part of the park. And when the people had left, they had left behind a lot of feral cattle in that area. And deer and other wild ungulates had also started utilizing that area. So it was decided that that would be the ideal spot to release these two sisters at, because that area hadn't been occupied by other tigers. And in case they found it difficult to hunt deer in the wild, there were still cattle which were much easier to kill that were available. And in any case, the sisters would have radio collars fitted around them. So in case things were not going as planned, in case success was not as desired, then they could always be captured and sent back to the enclosure. So they were released in Kanha, and they started doing fairly well. Around the same time, another reserve in the same state in central India called Panna had undergone a very sad sort of incident. Panna, there had been alarm bells ringing about Panna for a few years, that tigers there were getting poached. And a situation arose when in 2009, it was officially declared that not a single tiger was left in Panna. And various reasons were to blame for that. I mean, why Panna lost its tigers is a story for another day. We do not have time to discuss that today. But to cut a long story short, it was decided that tigers will be brought back to Panna, and that Panna will be fixed, and that all the causes of the problems will be rectified, and that tigers will once again be reintroduced into Panna. So these two sisters were considered good candidates for that. There were three or four other tigers that have been brought in from other parts of central India, and which had been translocated to Panna. And these sisters were also released there. And I wish I had time to tell you all the interesting things that happened while they were settling in, while they were exploring Panna, and how they settled in. But unfortunately, we have a limited amount of time. But again, to cut a long story short, the two sisters managed to settle in Panna. They managed to find mates over there. And one of the most interesting things that happened was when they were in the company of these young male tigers that had been introduced into Panna to restart a new population. They actually watched the males hunting, and what they had missed out from from not having a mother, they learned from their boyfriends, and they learned to fine-tune the art of stalking and hunting in Panna. And eventually they did mate with those males. They had cubs, and the most amazing thing and the most touching thing is that when they became mothers, they actually managed to teach the art of hunting very, very well to their own cubs. And now their cubs have cubs, and I think Panna has third and fourth generation tigers from these two sisters of Kanha. And from zero, the tiger population in Panna has now crossed 70, and it's been a fabulous success story. But the most amazing success story has been the fact that 3 orphaned cubs were found in the jungle, and at least 2 of them were raised, with a lot of challenge against a lot of people's opinions, and against a lot of by complete rebellion against the established order. They were nurtured to be fully wild tigers, and that project was such a success that it has now been institutionalized and is a standard operating protocol for any orphan cubs that are found. Many cubs have been saved from a life in captivity through the tiger rewilding process that was started in Kanha, and multiple tigers have been turned into wild tigers despite not having mothers. And the worst thing that could happen was if a tiger failed to develop the required skills to be a wild tiger, it might be sent to a zoo. But at least the tiger school at Kanha gives orphaned cubs a fighting chance to reclaim their wilderness, to reclaim their freedom. And it is something that is gradually being replicated in other parts of the country as well. So that was the story of the Tiger School of Kanha. And now I'd love to hear all the questions that you have for me.
What a fascinating story. Thank you so much for bringing that to us today. We've already got a lot of questions, but I just want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. All right, let's start at the beginning. Are citizens in the area receptive to protecting tigers?
Yes. Um, this is something I tell all my guests all the time, that India actually is a study in coexistence and conservation, because we have we probably exceeded China now in terms of our human population, and we are definitely one of the most densely populated countries in the world. Yet we have managed to protect all of Asia's um, large mammal species, large carnivores as well as large herbivores, in their largest, most stable populations in this country. So there is a huge cultural reason for it, a massive amount of cultural tolerance for other living beings, as well as very as well as some of the best drafted conservation policies and legislations in the world. Um, there are, it's always a work in progress when it comes to balancing the needs of people and conservation, communities and conservation, and it's always a negotiation. It's never either this or that. It's not black or white. It's gray. The meeting the needs of people and wildlife is always a continuing negotiation. And in that process, if the needs of people are looked after, and at the same time, if adequate space and protection for wild animals can be provided, then it works out. And the needs of people are being looked after in many, many ways. There are compensation programs for livestock, for example, that might be lost to tigers or leopards, or for crops that might be damaged by deer or elephants, things like that. But one of the best things that works, Sunny, in areas like Kanha, is that these are some of the finest wildlife tourism hotspots in the world, and there would be hardly a single family around Kanha, say within a 10 or 20-kilometer radius of Kanha, which would not have somebody or the other directly or indirectly involved in tourism, either as drivers or guides or homestay owners or uh, staff working in camps and lodges. Everybody has somebody or the other working directly for wildlife tourism. And what that does is that it forms an enormous vote bank for conservation. So people like our guests are ensuring that that model of conservation is not only working, but actually thriving in places like that.
Great clarification. Thank you so much. Is the young tiger in the video used to humans? Why did he not approach the people?
He's not used to humans, but he's used to jeeps. Most wild animals cannot tell that there are people in jeeps. They think of jeeps as some sort of large animal that never leaves the road and never chases anything. So be it Africa, be it India, wherever people go on safari, you'll find that animals are quite comfortable with vehicles, but if they see a person on foot, then they become, their instincts kick in, and the flight or fight response comes into play. But that tiger in that video is behaving like any other tiger in the tourism zone, which is being absolutely confident around jeeps. But I'm sure he would run away if he saw a person approaching on foot or on a bicycle or something like that.
Mm. Any update on the male that was transferred to the zoo?
He's living a life in the zoo. He was, once a tiger is sent to the zoo, it lives its life there. So he must have lived a natural life and died there.
Mm. And what happens if the tiger population exceeds the capacity of the area? How is that determined? And given the habitat loss to date, anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, sure. So the reserves in India, unlike the reserves in many parts of Southern Africa, not even East Africa like Kenya and Tanzania, but Southern Africa, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Unlike the reserves there, our reserves are not fenced. Our reserves are natural landscapes. They're protected landscapes within a much larger landscape. And these landscapes are spread over, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. So there's, for example, the Central India tiger landscape, of which Kanha is a part, spreads across 8 states in the heart of India. And there is still good habitat contiguity, habitat connectivity between these reserves, and a lot of functional wildlife corridors. So once a reserve begins to spill out, the animals will then disperse into the larger landscape and find other habitats to settle in. So that's how it works.
Mm. Well, that is the last question we have time for today, so I will hand it back to you for closing comments.
Thank you so much, Sunny, and thank you all of our wonderful audience. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. You always bring us such interesting topics, and your storytelling is just, I want to sit at your feet and listen to you tell stories all day. I want to thank everybody who tuned in as well. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nadhab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.